or on Staten Island, New York, for about 50 minutes.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out to Barnes & Noble tonight. We are here to welcome Terry Galway, author of So Others Might Live, History of the New York Fire Department from 1700 to the present. Mr. Galway will be here to discuss his book and answer any questions you guys might have. And I just want to let you guys know, if you do have questions, just wait for the gentleman from C-SPAN, Pete and Sean, to come around with the microphone so we can hear your questions very clearly. So that's it. Please welcome Terry Galway.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be on Staten Island. It's nice to see so many friends and so many relatives. There you go. And it's also nice to see a fellow who I remember from 35 years ago. I remember distinctly that pitch on the outside corner, and the 10-year-old Arnie Matson struck me out. I was 12 years old and an all-star. He was 10 years old and a punk. And now he's running for Congress from Staten Island. So it was nice to see Arnie. And of course, Arnie is a retired firefighter, something he has in common with a few people here tonight. And needless to say, I don't have to tell most of you this, but Staten Island is the perfect place in a terrible way and in a great way to start this book tour, which I'm embarking on tonight, which will take me to 6 or 7 cities around the country. Staten Island, I describe in the book as the ground zero of grief, because on September 11th, Staten Island lost so many people, including 70 firefighters, more than 70 firefighters, and many civilians. So much so that in one parish I talk about in the book, St. Clair's, my father's old parish, there were 30 funerals and memorial services, 11 of them for firefighters and the rest for civilians. Staten Island knew the cost of September 11th. And one of the things that, of course, is so attractive to Staten Island, even though there are parts of Staten Island today that I don't necessarily recognize from 35 years ago, but one of the things that I still find amazing is that it is a place where firefighters and police officers live side by side with men and women who work at places like Cantor Fitzgerald, Sandler O'Neill. It's a wonderful community, and I think observing it from afar, because I live in New Jersey now, observing it through the work of the Staten Island Advance after September 11th, reading the stories of those firefighters, broke my heart and broke the hearts, I think, of everybody. One of the stories in particular that touched me, that I read about in the Advance, that was written by my old friend Jay Price, was the story of Lieutenant Chuck Margiotta. Some of you may have known Chuck. We crossed paths in high school. I think we probably played ball together a few times many years ago. And Jay Price, in his story about Chuck, mentioned that he was on his way home from a night tour on September 11th, coming home about 9 o'clock on the Staten Island Expressway, and he heard about the attacks over the radio. He gets off the expressway and drives to the nearest firehouse, which is the quarters for Rescue 5, gets on the rig, calls his mother while he's going over the bridge, and that's the last anybody heard from him. And one of the remarkable things about that story, I thought, was that spirit that led Chuck Margiotta to get off a highway and jump on a rig. Any firefighter from 1940, from 1840, or from 1740 would have recognized that courage and that instinct to go where you're needed, even though you don't have to be there. And Chuck Margiotta didn't have to be there, but he went there. And as I say, one of the things that I was able to see in researching the history of the fire department is that there was this, throughout the department's years, and even before the department was formed, firefighters went where they're needed. They don't think about the cost. They don't think about the potential. They go because they're needed, so others might live. And what makes my book, I think, a little bit different than many of the September 11th books you're going to see, or have seen, and what makes this book a little bit different than many of the other fine firefighting books that are out there now, is that rather than focus on one day, September 11th, and the aftermath, I took the story of the fire department from its very inception. Now, technically, the fire department of New York started in 1865. That was when New York got its first professional fire department. But I looked at a broader topic, which is fire service. That is, putting out fires. And it's one of the most basic things when you think about it. So I took it all the way back to Peter Stuyvesant's New Amsterdam, where I discovered a few things that would sound familiar, I think, even to firefighters and New Yorkers today. For example, Peter Stuyvesant, one of the first things Peter Stuyvesant did when he took over in New Amsterdam, because New Amsterdam was constantly burning down. They put up buildings, they burned down. Put another building, they burned down. It reminded me of the castle in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. They build it, pull down. Same thing in New Amsterdam. They didn't have any water, and they didn't have any building codes. And so what you see in New Amsterdam is the first sort of attempt by a government to come in and tell somebody what they can do and what they can't do with their personal property, which was revolutionary in the 1600s. You had Stuyvesant come in. At one point, he hires a couple of people, and their job is to go into everybody's house and inspect their chimneys and inspect other aspects of their structure. And if they were not up to the code, they were fined. And if they didn't allow those inspectors in, they were fined. So I sort of described them as the sort of early equivalent of meter readers. That was their job, to come in. And eventually Stuyvesant realized that it is not necessarily a good thing to build houses right on top of each other. Oh, that sounds like Staten Island today, I'm sorry. But he thought it was maybe not a good idea to build house after house after house and have straw roofs and expect these houses to continue to function. So he set about doing something called zoning regulations, which obviously is well ahead of his time there. So I thought that that would be a good place to talk about the fact that, in urban America, as people began settling in cities, one of the first things they had to do was figure out how to put out fires. And it was there in the very beginning that you saw the first firefighters in New York. And things were a little bit different back then, needless to say. The way they put out fires was they ran to the East River, loaded up the buckets, ran with the buckets, and put out the fires that way. Eventually, they decided that this was not necessarily the most effective way to put out a fire, but what to do. In 1731, New York gets its first fire engines, and many historians say that's where the fire service in New York really started. Because once you get fire engines over here, all of a sudden your average civilian who was expected to volunteer, if there was a fire in New Amsterdam or in British New York before 1730 and you were an able-bodied male, you were expected to man the bucket brigades. Well, once you get a fire engine, and what they basically had to do was fill it with water, pump it, and then point it. It's a little bit more sophisticated. They decide the time has come for a volunteer fire department. So in around 1731, 1732, you get New York's first fire department. And they are, in many ways, the ancestors of the firefighters of today. And that volunteer force stayed that way, again, until 1865. And but in the first few years of American independence, New York reverted back to form. In 1776, 1778, and throughout the 1820s, New York is burning down again. And all of a sudden, people are saying, we just can't have this. These volunteers are very good, but we can't keep having the city burned down. And the culmination of that period occurs in 1835. And this was something I didn't know much about. I had been tinkering with the idea of doing a history of the fire department before September 11th. It being the son of a firefighter and son-in-law and godson and cousin and nephew and everything else, I couldn't help but know a little bit about the fire department history. But what I didn't know was that in 1835, New York suffered a catastrophe that is eerily similar to September 11th, except for the fact that September 11th cost the lives of 3,000 people, and what is called the Great Fire of 1835 actually ended in only 2 deaths. But the destruction was simply amazing. 650 buildings burned down, and about 52 acres of downtown Manhattan were wiped out. In fact, after that fire was over, it occurred in December of 1835, most people in America decided that New York was finished, that the future financial capital of America would either be Boston or Philadelphia. New York was gone. And what was really striking after that fire, and I saw the records up at the New York Historical Society, I don't know when the last time anybody looked at them was, but what was really striking and heartening, and again, reminding you of September 11th, is that after this utter catastrophe, after basically downtown New York ceased to exist in 1835, the citizens of Boston, Philadelphia, Albany, Buffalo, Montreal, throughout the Northeast United States and Canada, came together and asked the federal government, well, the citizens of Montreal didn't, they had no business, they donated money. But the citizens of the United States came together and asked Washington to do the unprecedented, which would be to step in and help New York in its hour of need. And a Boston congressman got up on the floor of the House and said, New York's disaster is the nation's disaster. New York's catastrophe is a national catastrophe. And so for the first time in American history, in 1835, you have the federal government taking the step of assisting a community after a disaster. And obviously that has continued, that policy has continued, but it had never happened until that time. One of the aftermaths of the 1835 fire, which affected the fire department a great deal, was that the politicians decided that the fire department was not very good. And so among the things they did was they started insulting the fire chief. Now, those of you who are firefighters in the audience know it is never a good thing for politicians to insult a fire chief. And sure enough, on January 1st, 1836, there was a fire, and an alderman, sort of a city councilman, an alderman went to the fire as he was required to do, and he was carrying his staff. Now, these days, if a politician's carrying his staff, that's some politician because the staff is about, but this was a real staff. So the firemen recognized poor Alderman Purdy, and they get off the fire truck and they said, you know, where do you think you're going? And the poor alderman says, well, you know, I'm an alderman. Well, that was the point. So they beat him up. And one of the assailants was a guy named Lightbody. Now, John Lightbody, everything I've read about John Lightbody suggests to me that he was not particularly well named. But he apparently got off pretty easy. And this led to a great tension between politicians and the fire department that would, as Mayor Bloomberg would probably tell you, continues to exist to this day. So at one point, to get back at the fire department in mid-1836, the city council, or the common council it was called at the time, the common council decides they're going to fire the fire chief, whose name was James Gullick. So the word got down. Now, you talk about bad timing. I mean, you know, there might be a time to fire a fire chief, but it's generally accepted, I think, that you don't fire a fire chief while there's a fire in progress. The Common Council of the City of New York decided to fire the fire chief while he was on duty with his men, and they were all men back then, of course. And when word got down to the firefighters, they said, oh, okay, well, we're leaving too, and left the scene of a fire. So, you know, there are some people in this audience who participated in the UFA fire department strike in 1973, and many people said it was, you know, history, because the first time the fire department had walked off the job in a labor dispute, 1836, they walked away from that fire, and eventually were persuaded to come back to the fire by the chief himself, who said, you know, maybe there's a time and a place for this, but not now. So, in any case, Chief Gullick was fired. And what the fire department decided to do to get back at the politicians was they ran him for an obscure office called the City Register. Had no power, but the fire department was determined to make a point that it will brook no interference from politicians. Politicians can run the city. We will run the fire department. We will decide how to put out fires. Thank you very much. So they run this guy Gullick for City Register, and you see the editorials in the newspapers were saying, oh, well, who do these firefighters think? They think a firefighter is going, of course they said fireman back then, you think a fireman is going to win an election? Based on what? Well, guess what? He won. And in the next election, the firefighters did it again. They picked one of their own, ran him for office for state assembly, and won. So there was a precedent, Arnie Mattson, for firefighters winning elections in New York. So what that led to was sort of what it led to was politicians standing up and saying, you know what, these firefighters mean business, and maybe there's something we should do some outreach here, community outreach. So beginning of sort of the 1840s, after this incident, New York's clubhouses, political clubhouses, Tammany Hall, and other clubhouses begin to sort of merge with firehouses. So you get this very interesting thing where the best way to get a fire department job, and they were all volunteers back then, but so many people wanted to volunteer that they often were waiting lists. The best way to become a volunteer firefighter was to sort of get affiliated with either your local political clubhouse or your local gang. Sometimes they were interchangeable. And one of the most famous firefighters in the 19th century did just that. His name was William Tweed. You might know him as Boss Tweed. He gained fame and some bit of fortune by becoming a volunteer firefighter. And he was so popular, he was elected to become the foreman of Engine 6, which was called the Big Six. The foreman would be roughly the equivalent of a captain. And that was how he got his political career started. Now, in the meantime, a very interesting thing is going on in New York, where volunteer fire companies are sort of jockeying with each other for the privilege of putting out a fire. Because back then, you didn't have battalions, you didn't have this. You know, the first one at the fire, put it out. And of course, it was considered to be a great honor to put out a fire. And it was considered a dishonor to not put out the fire. You're there first, you get the hose. Everybody else is on the relay. So as a result, firefighters started to express their opinions to one another in a way that was occasionally violent. In fact, I'm just going to read a little bit of the book. In the late 1840s, there was one of the great battles ever fought by the fire department. Had nothing to do with fire, but everything to do with fighting. And a guy who a historian who wrote in the 19th century, who knew some of the people involved, described this fight this way. He said, "The shock of battle rolled down the line, and quicker than it takes to write these words, 1,000 sturdy, stalwart fellows were fiercely grappling one another in hand-to-hand fight. The din was frightful. The fighters were so thick there was scarcely room for one to fall. Those who were unlucky enough to find Mother Earth were nearly trampled to death by the feet of friend and foe before they could escape. Those were from Engine Company 15 and from Engine Company 40. So, needless to say, there was some sentiment in the city that maybe it was not a good idea for firefighters to be fighting each other while they are supposed to be fighting fires. So, a new chief was brought in, a guy by the name of Alfred Carson. And you knew there was going to be trouble between the politicians and the fire department and Chief Carson when the newspapers reported that Chief Carson's favorite beverage was sarsaparilla. That was a tip-off that maybe this guy was serious about reforming fire department and the politicians. Because what's also going on at this time is the gangs are beginning to attack firefighters just for the fun of it. And well, those of you who fought fires in the Bronx and in Brooklyn and in, mostly Brooklyn and Bronx and parts of Manhattan will recognize what because in many cases that was similar in the 1960s when firefighters came under attack and people were shocked, and rightfully so. Well, the same thing was going on in the 1850s. And Carson, the chief, was determined to protect his firefighters from the gangs, protect his firefighters from the politicians, but also to protect his firefighters from one another, from the firefighters like Bill Tweed. So one day in 1850, Bill Tweed, the future boss, gets into an unbelievable brawl with Engine 6, his men in Engine 6, and another fire company. And Carson says, well, this is just unacceptable. So the Board of Aldermen, oh, did I mention that Bill Tweed had run for political office by this time? The Board of Aldermen decide that Bill Tweed is to be suspended as a firefighter forever. Well, there was some conversations took place, and the next day the Board of Aldermen met in secret session where resolution, now we don't know what happened because it was in secret session, but the gist, I think, was that the Board of Aldermen decided that, pursuant to the case of William Tweed, the term and word forever is to be defined as no more than 90 days. So Bill Tweed got off. And Chief Carson went bananas. And he went before the city council, and he called them basically a bunch of rogues and dared them to fire him, and went on and carried on forever. And as a result, Chief Carson was fired. Because, after all, you don't go before the Board of Aldermen and say that they're a bunch of rogues and thieves and expect to get away with it. So these rather colorful part of New York's firefighting history. Of course, in that time, of course, there were many fires, and the department was beginning to resemble the kind of urban fire department we have today, except for the fact that there were so many of them. There was, by the 1860s, there were about 5,000 firefighters. The city council was just, if you want to be a firefighter, sure. You want to find your own company, fine. That's fine. So eventually, in 1865, the powers that be in New York, mainly the insurance industry, and you can understand why, the building industry, and to a lesser extent the politicians, mostly the capitalists of the time, said, you know what, we need a professional fire service. There's just no question about that. And so after much wrangling in 1865, right before the end of the Civil War, the Fire Department of New York is formed. And that is the beginning of sort of the modern history of the fire department. And from 5,000 volunteers, it went down to 1,000 paid firefighters. This was now going to be their job. Now, the interesting thing that happens over the next few decades is that firefighters, because of what had happened in the 1840s and 1850s, which sounds like a lot of fun now, but I mean, if your building was burning down and they were fighting, it didn't sound so much fun. But firefighters had sort of come into a bit of disrepute. And it was obviously not the real firefighters who were beating each other up. It was the Bill Tweeds, of the real politicians of the time. So all eyes were really on these professional firefighters now in 1865 to sort of show what a real firefighter could do. And it's at that time you see the emergence of people like a fellow who I discovered I knew nothing about, John Bresnan, who becomes a battalion chief in Battalion 6, and Hugh Bonner, who not only becomes a battalion chief, he eventually becomes the chief of department and then commissioner. And these two are Irish immigrants who fled Ireland in the 1840s, who grew up in the Five Points. Now, many of you know the Five Points neighborhood in Manhattan in the 1850s was the worst neighborhood by far. And New York public opinion in the 1860s was not particularly friendly to the Irish, not particularly friendly to immigrants, not particularly friendly to Catholics. And there was a suggestion that a department which is dominated by this group would invariably fall back on bad habits. And what I find amazing and interesting and very moving about John Bresnan, who was born poor, and Hugh Bonner, also born poor, living in the Five Points, is that these two men, and others, but these two men, turned the fire department, turned fire service into fire science. They're the ones who start the School of Instruction. For the first time, New York firefighters in the 1880s are now getting trained. They're the ones who insisted on civil service testing. So they're asking the fire department to maintain the highest professional standards they can. And again, what's amazing about that is nobody in the 1860s would have ever expected that from a couple of Irish Catholics from the Five Points. They would have expected just the opposite. And Bresnan in particular is an interesting character, first of all, because I was able to track down his great-grandson, who was a lieutenant and who retired just before September 11th. There were 4 generations of the Bresnan family connected to the fire department. But he also was a reformer, and he and Bonner were both reformers in the sense that they wanted to bring social change to the neighborhoods that they had left behind. So what you begin to see in the 1890s is these two great chiefs going to the Protestant establishment of New York and saying, we've got to do something about people living in the tenements. And this is at a time where Jacob Riis has written How the Other Half Lives, how New Yorkers are beginning to realize that there's this immigrant population on the Lower East Side and other places that are living in deplorable conditions. And it's time to do something about it. So you get these two men who were from those deplorable conditions who say yes, and that's not the half of it. You should see the fire hazards. You should see the fire escapes that, for the most part, don't exist, but when they do exist, they're filled with junk. You should see the landlords who aren't adhering to the most rudimentary building codes. And so they work with these elite New Yorkers who were part of the Housing Reform Commission of the 1890s. And they basically make life better and safer for poor New Yorkers. And this is sort of fire prevention at its very beginnings. At one point, either Bonner or Bresnan, I don't remember which one, basically said, I'd rather prevent a fire than put one out. Of course, that was the exact opposite of what the volunteers in the 1840s, they didn't want to prevent fires, they wanted to fight them because that's what they did. But in the 1890s, you begin to see much more of an emphasis on prevention through these two characters. And John Bresnan, unfortunately, comes to a very sad end. He was a widower with 3 children, and he died in a fire in 1894 when a water tank collapsed through a building, leaving his children orphans. And of course, one of his sons winds up becoming the chief dispatcher from the Bronx. So he also had the title of chief. He retired in the 1950s. His son became a firefighter, and his son, Bill Bresnan, of Ladder 15, I guess, in downtown, he was the fellow I talked to who watched the Twin Towers fall a few months after he had retired. And the great transition that took place in the fire department after these guys kind of leave the scene is, of course, the modern fire department of New York comes into existence in 1898 with the consolidation of the 5 boroughs into one city of New York. Because until then, the New York Fire Department consisted of Manhattan and parts of the Bronx. So all of a sudden, you've got now, the fire department is responsible for 300 square miles. And just to give you an idea of what some of the statistics were like, the fire department in 1898 consisted of 63 engine companies and 22 ladder companies and 1,200 firefighters. Once the 5 boroughs come into existence, all of a sudden it's 121 engine companies, 46 ladder companies, and about 3,000 firefighters. That includes the volunteers who are on Staten Island. So that's the sort of beginning of the fire department of New York as we know it. And one of the first great tests of the fire department in the 20th century is really one of the most famous fires to this day in New York and in the United States, and that would be the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And that fire set off a series of reforms that led to, really, you would argue, I know Uncle Mike Foy would disagree with this, but sort of the spectacular rise of the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt. But just to remind you of what the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was all about, there in a factory on the 9th floor of a building that still stands off Washington Square Park was a factory, textile factory, employed mostly teenage girls, Jewish immigrants who worked, day in and day out under deplorable conditions. And at that time, there was another great chief of the New York Fire Department by the name of Edward Croker. And Croker was the nephew of Richard Croker, who was sort of the boss tweed of his day. But sort of Edward Croker was the good Croker, a spectacular fireman, fantastic fireman. But everybody thought he got his job through his nephew. It turned out not at all. He had won medals, he had won all sorts of honors, and he becomes one of the great chiefs of the fire department. And in 1911, at the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, not long after Croker had gone to the factory owners and had gone to Wall Street and said to them in so many words, something has to be done about the conditions that these people are working in. Not to say he didn't mention Triangle Shirtwaist, he mentioned factories in general. You have to have fire escapes. You have to have clear paths to fire escapes. You have to have a minimal adherence to a fire code. And what was said about him was, oh, he's just trying to sell sprinklers. He's Richard Croker's nephew. So he was defamed for this. And at the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, Edward Croker is on the sidewalk watching bodies plummet from the 9th and 10th floors of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And he delivers one of the most impassioned speeches I think I've ever heard to the reporters who were there. And he says, and this is, again, as this tragedy is unfolding, 9 stories above, he said, look around everywhere, gesturing to the smoking buildings. Nowhere will you find fire escapes. They say they don't look sightly. I have tried to force their installation, and only last Friday, a manufacturers association met in Wall Street to oppose my plan. The large loss of life is due to this neglect. This is, while it's happening, Croker is pointing fingers, and I think, personally, pointing them in the right direction. Because with Croker, you have the continuation of something that continues today, that of the crusading fire chief, who is telling the New York building industry, who's telling the people who put up skyscrapers, you have to think about fire. They may look pretty, but you have to think about fire. And they didn't listen back then. And if you listen to another great crusading chief he's retired now, Chief Vinnie Dunn, a legend in the New York Fire Department, they're expert in building collapses. He is campaigning to get better construction downtown when downtown New York is rebuilt. Vinnie Dunn is in the great tradition of fire chiefs from Bresnan to Bonner to O'Hagan and now to Vinnie Dunn, and he's doing us all a public service. So there again, I picked up a theme that I thought resonated with what was going on today, where you have a great disaster and fire chiefs saying, look, when we do this again, let's do it right. Let's spend a little money. Let's put in some sprinklers. Let's get better construction methods. Let's not care so much about what it looks like. Let's care about whether it's safe. Now, I want to take some questions in a couple of minutes, but I do want to talk a little bit about a chapter I call the war years. And the reason I want to talk a little bit about that is because some people in this room fought in the war years. And we're talking about that time in the Fire Department of New York, roughly from 1966 to 1978. It was a time of total disintegration socially throughout the country, and the Fire Department of New York was on the front lines of that battle. And most firefighters you talk to who were on the job, particularly those who were in what we on Staten Island refer to as the city, those who fought in there, refer to it as the war years, because to give you an idea of what was going on in the Fire Department of New York and in New York in the 1960s, in 1960, the number of false alarms in New York was 13,326. In 1967, that number was 48,106. And by 1978, the number of false alarms in the city of New York, 285,290. The number of fires in 1960, 60,941. 1977, 129,619. 1976, 153,263. All that while, the Fire Department of New York was shrinking from 14,000 to 11,000 during the height of the fiscal crisis. Firefighters were getting laid off. They went on strike for 5.5 hours in 1973, and their workload, as you can see, increased immeasurably. And one of the amazing things I find is I talk to veterans of those days, people who were in Bushwick in 1977 during the blackout when Bushwick burned and continued to burn for the next 5 years. I talked with people who fought fires in the South Bronx, and they all said, there's nowhere else I would have rather been. We went to work knowing we were going to fight a fire, maybe 2, maybe even 3 if we were lucky. That was the enthusiasm they brought to the job. And I personally just find that remarkable. But of all of the things that were horrific, I think the spread of false alarms in the 70s signified to me, it was clearly a sad commentary on New York. And I talked to a guy who later was at the command post in the North Tower of the World Trade Center on September 11th, a chief by the name of Pete Hayden. And he said to me that when he was in Rescue 2 in Brooklyn, he could trace the pattern of false alarms. He said it would be 3 o'clock in the afternoon and you'd get an alarm from the pull box outside the local school. Then you'd get one 3 blocks down the street, then another one a few blocks away. Then you'd get another one and you'd realize he or she had turned east or west and was going down the block. They could trace one person, one kid, going from the school home by the alarm boxes they pulled. And quite frankly, in that context, it really was no wonder that the UFA in 1973 had said to the city, look, this is enough. You've got to do something for us. And that it was that sort of contentious time that led to the 5.5-hour strike in 1972. Things improved immeasurably for the fire department once Ed Koch became mayor and the city started to become a little bit back fiscally. And the note I'd like to end on is actually not about September 11th, because I think we've heard enough about September 11th today. Certainly we'll never learn enough about it. But a couple of months ago when I was writing this book, I talked with two veteran firefighters, one Reggie Julius, 78 years old, and Vinnie Julius, his brother, 75 years old. He was a captain. Reggie was a battalion chief in 12th Battalion. They're both African-American firefighters who came on the job, Reggie in 1949, Vinnie in 1951. And they told me stories that, you know, it was tough to be an African-American firefighter in the late 40s and early 50s. But when I had lunch with them in May, the day Ray Downey was buried, I think it was May, they didn't want to talk about that. They just wanted to talk about the job. They wanted to talk about how much fun it was to be a firefighter. And at one point, Vinnie Julius said to me, and he sort of described, I think, pretty well about something about firefighting. He said, it's about ordinary people who have found a calling over and above what the average person does. You go into a burning building, down a hallway, you see what we call the red demon, and that red demon's fingers are reaching out for you, and they're saying, come on, I've got something for you. Come on, and you put down your head and you keep moving. I wish I could make up that kind of dialogue, but that's what Vinnie Julius told me. And later on, a few minutes later, this fantastic storyteller and his brother, we were outside looking at the firehouse near my house in South Orange, New Jersey, and they're sort of comparing notes and looking at the rig. And of course, nothing as good as the fire department of New York, and they're sort of looking at the small firehouse and small fire company and sort of being very patronizing, very nice. But at one point, Vinnie Julius, they're getting in the car to go home, and Reggie Julius opens up his trunk. And inside of his trunk, he's got his own old turnout coat and his hat, his helmet from the 12th Battalion, and his boots. I said, well, what are they for? I mean, Chief, you know, you've been off the job for 15 years. He was at Ground Zero at 78 years old, working 12-hour shifts. And, of course, that was amazing. And he closed the trunk. And then I talked to his brother, Vinnie Julius, who was smoking a cigarette. See, I go for realism here now. And he put out the cigarette, and he said, you know, I'm 75 years old. He said, I've had a good life. I've had a great career. I could die tomorrow. But if I die tomorrow, I'm coming back as a firefighter for the city of New York. Thank you very much.
If you guys have any questions, is it all there? Take them right now. Yeah.
Questions? Ms. Monahan? Wait.
Hi, Terry. Your dad was a firefighter. How
Yes.
much input did you get from him and your godfather in writing this book?
Well, there are two ways of answering that question. One, the truth, one, no, I'm only kidding. Well, you know, I mean, obviously, I've been hearing stories about the fire department, you know, since I was a kid. And that was one of the reasons why I had thought about doing this history before 9/11. About a year ago or so, a guy by the name of Tom Repetto wrote a history of the police department. And it was at that time I was thinking, well, gee, you know, I know a little bit about the fire department. Maybe, you know, I should start putting together some material here, and maybe, you know, someday, you know, I'll get a book contract and write a history of the fire department. But I think that one of the things that I thought was important, well, I was on the phone with my father, particularly near deadline. I was saying, all right, look, Dad, tell me again the standpipe. Now, explain to me again what the standpipe works, how that works. And look, you know, how do you do that hydrant thing? I mean, you know, I didn't know. And I certainly consulted my father on the, you know, and my Uncle Frank, my godfather. I talked to them about the strike, you know, because, you know, this is living history. And they lived through it, so of course I talked to them. But by the same token, you know, I did want to write a history, even though I'm a firefighter's son and son-in-law and godson and cousin and nephew, I did want to write a history that was objective, that was a work of scholarship, and that told it as I saw it. And while this book is clearly a tribute to the courage and bravery and sacrifice and selflessness of not just the New York Fire Department, but of firefighters everywhere, this book is dedicated to my parents, my in-laws, my godfather, and to all firefighting families. And I think that the attributes that you saw on September 11th were not unique in many ways to the fire department of New York. They're unique to firefighters, emergency personnel everywhere. They are our heroes, not, athletes, not Hollywood celebrities. These people do the work. So in that respect, I was, I've been consulting my father and godfather every day of my life, and boy, they're probably pretty tired of it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I certainly could tell some other stories. Yes.
As a full-time writer, anyway, did you have a hard time focusing on the book and your full-time job? How was that process?
Excuse me, I happen to work for a very generous employer called the New York Observer. Arthur Carter is my publisher. Peter Kaplan is my editor, and they knew how important this book was to me. So they very generously said, look, you take whatever time you need to write this book. Check back with us every now and again. Let us know that you're aware that it's 2002 and not, in fact, 1840. And let us know that you know that the mayor is Bloomberg and that the county leader is not Boss Tweed. But so they were very, very understanding. This is my 5th book I've written at the Observer. And every time I'm amazed at the generosity of my employers. So that's the answer. And I also, by the way, have a very patient wife and 2 children who know not to bother me when I'm sort of muttering in front of the laptop. That's very important too. Actually, they do bother me on occasion, but that's right. Did Mr. Mattson have a question?
Well, one thing about education. This book will educate people. Most of the books on the fire department we've read in the last year talk about 2 weeks, 2 months of a certain situation in the city. This goes back to the history of the fire department, and when I first got on the fire department in 1981, it was a history that I didn't know much about, and there were some old books in the firehouse, and there'd be some old stories in what they call the WNYF magazine, which was with New York City Firefighters. And that was the magazine where you'd read those articles about Bresnan, all right, and Croker, and they would always talk about these chiefs, but you'd only see these magazines in the firehouse. It's sort of like today where normally the only time you would see somebody wearing an FDNY hat, it would be a fireman. The only time you'd see somebody wearing an FDNY t-shirt would be a fireman. And you kind of knew if you'd see somebody at a Little League game, or if you saw him at a touch tackle football game, or even at a PTA meeting late at night, you knew that guy was a fireman because he wore that t-shirt. By today's standards, I was up at Ground Zero 2 weeks ago, and it just shows the curiosity of the people, and they want to be part. Sort of like when the Yankees finally got back into the World Series, everybody's wearing a Yankee hat again. But Terry, I want to tell you that this is a book that should have been around 30 years ago, and I'm glad you've taken the time to write it, because a lot of the books written in the last year were put together in a week, and I'm sure that you really put the time in. And I know Terry, starting back in Our Lady Helper Christian School in Tottenville, going back to the 60s, when we were in school, when his father was fighting fires. My father was a policeman for 25 years. And we were sons of civil servants. And a civil servant is a lot of people that go to Manhattan every day and don't really know what that means. But they got a good taste of it, and they got a never-ending story last September 11th, because the word servant is what it's all about. And I wish you luck with the book, and tell the people what's next on the agenda, because I'm looking forward to getting your next book, too.
Well, thanks, Arnie. Well, as a matter of fact, I am working on another book. I had been working on it. I had been working on it when 9/11 happened. I'm working on a biography of a Revolutionary War general named Nathaniel Greene, who was sort of at George Washington's side everywhere. But, as is true of most sidekicks, you remember Costello, you remember Abbott, for the most part. He's been ignored, and I found it amazing that this one general could be at so many battles and sort of not have his due. So while I was formulating the idea to write a history of the fire department, I actually was working on General Greene, and then once 9/11 happened, I thought General Greene could wait a little while. and I would get to this more pressing issue. But hopefully that book will be out in about a year and a half, and and then it'll be on to another one. Yes.
Earlier you spoke about the Triangle fire, and then shortly thereafter you talked about the World Trade Center catastrophe. Do you see any relationship between the two, and in the codes and the causes of the catastrophic damage and injury?
Well, sure. That's a very good question. I mean, in the case of Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, I mean, you had criminal neglect. That certainly wouldn't be true in the World Trade Center. I mean, obviously that was an act of war. That was not gross negligence as the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was. However, if you would talk to some people who are a lot smarter than I am about building codes, like Vinnie Dunn, Chief Vinnie Dunn, he'll tell you that the lightweight construction that went into the World Trade Center, and that's designed to get more floor space. You build it that way, you get more floor space, you can make more money. Right. Vinnie Dunn's told me that a firefighter's idea of a skyscraper is the Empire State Building. Cement, solid construction, Their idea of a horror is the World Trade Center. And so I guess the correlation would be, once again, the fire department is going to be going to builders and architects and people like that, and the real estate industry and the insurance industry. And they're going to say, let's not let this happen again. Let's do something. Let's be proactive. Let's spend a little money to do what's right, rather than to do what's cheapest and what's most cost effective and what can make the most money. So I think there is a correlation in that sense, in the sense that the department has always been on the side of greater safety and stricter building codes.
We have time for one more question, guys.
Anybody? No? Brian Hawk, you don't have a question? Come on.
I came in during the session, so forgive me if I'm duplicating something that might have been touched on already. But my grandfather was a fireman, and an uncle as well. My grandfather worked in downtown Brooklyn at the J Street Firehouse. They fought fires on piers. They fought fires with equipment that was so primitive compared to what they have today. When you talked to the men who've been in the business of determining what's the best equipment, how do we fight the fires of the future, is there any sense that this will be a safe job a generation from now? Is it possible that the wives of firemen 20 years from now won't have to worry that their man won't come home the next day?
Well, unfortunately, the answer to that is no. Bill Feehan, the first deputy commissioner who was killed on September 11th at the age of 71 years old, he gave an interview which was being played at the New York Historical Society the last time I was there a few months ago. It was on a loop. And he said, very eloquently, this was taped a couple of months before September 11th. And he said, and his voice sort of echoed in my mind as I was writing this book and trying to answer that very question. And he said, there have been 700 and something firefighters killed in line of duty. That was before September 11th. And he said, no matter what we do, no matter how much we invest in technology, no matter how much we think buildings are fireproof, there's going to be a 700. It's going to go to 800. That number's going to go higher. It's the nature of the job. But hopefully there will be lessons learned, not just from what happened at the World Trade Center, which of course let's hope is an anomaly, but, from fires that happened today. One of the things that firefighters actually sometimes complain about is that there are no big fires anymore. They actually complain about that, which I find amazing. But people still get killed, and men and women are putting their lives in danger all the time. But nothing is going to take the risk out of firefighting, which says a lot about the people who choose that as their profession.
All right, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight, and especially Mr. Terry Galway.
Thank you.
I would like to rearrange something because if you're shooting in there, you're going to get deflected.
Okay.
Can we get that?
Terry Galway's father, father-in-law, godfather, and uncles were all New York firefighters. So Others Might Live is published by Basic Books, online at basicbooks.com. Next week on History on Book TV, Pauline Mayer and other historians discuss their book, Inventing America.